If you're watching this, it's likely because you or someone you care about has struggled to navigate the incredibly complex, often frustrating, and widely misunderstood landscape of weight loss. Welcome to the first episode of the 5-part series on metabolic psychiatry and the neuroscience of weight regulation. For the last 50 years, the public conversation around obesity has been dominated by a single reductionist equation, calories in versus calories out. And while the laws of thermodynamics are valid, energy balance does determine weight, that equation is practically useless when it comes to understanding the behavior of eating and the physiology of storage. Telling someone with obesity to simply eat less is like telling someone with fever to simply cool down. It describes the outcome we want, but it completely ignores the regulatory systems that are driving the temperature up in the first place. In this series, we're going to dismantle the simplistic view of obesity as a failure of willpower. Instead, we're going to build a new framework based on the most current peer-reviewed literature in neurology, endocrinology, and psychiatry. We're going to look at obesity not just as a metabolic condition, but as a neurometabolic condition. We're going to explore how the brain processes reward, how it senses energy needs, and how in the modern environment, those ancient signaling pathways can become hijacked, leading to a state of biological confusion that results in excess adipose tissue. I want to be very clear from the outset. Obesity is multifactorial. There is no single cause. It's not just sugar and sedentary behavior. It's not just your genetics. It's not just trauma. Based on peer-reviewed research, it's the complex collision of specific genetic heritage with specific modern environment mediated by the nervous system. Today in episode 1, we're going to focus on the machinery of the brain. We're going to discuss the neural circuits that govern appetite, the difference between wanting and liking, and why for many people the drive to eat feels less like a choice and more like a survival imperative. To understand this, we have to start by acknowledging that you actually have two pathways when it comes to food. First, you have the homeostatic pathway of brain. This is primarily located in the hypothalamus, a small region at the base of the brain that acts like a thermostat. Its job is to keep you alive. It monitors your fuel stores. It receives signals from your gut, your fat cells, and your liver. When the fuel is low, it triggers hunger. When your fuel is sufficient, it triggers satiety. It is a precise, elegant negative feedback loop. But then you have the hedonic pathway of brain. This involves the reward circuitry, the mesolimbic dopamine system. This system did not evolve to measure calories. It evolved to motivate you to seek out survival advantages. It's driven by cues, by reward, by stress relief, and by anticipation of pleasure. In a healthy, natural environment, these two pathways work in harmony. You get hungry, you seek food. You eat, you feel good, and you stop. But in the context of obesity, these two systems decouple. The hedonic brain begins to override the homeostatic brain. The wanting drowns out the fullness. Now, I'm curious, as you hear about these two systems, can you identify which one usually wins in your own life? Drop a comment below. Understanding your own pathways is the first step in recalibrating the signal. So let's go deep in the mechanism of how this happens. We need to talk about dopamine. There is a pervasive myth that dopamine is the pleasure molecule. You eat a cookie, dopamine is released, and you feel joy. That is technically incorrect. According to the pioneering work of researchers like Dr. Kent Berridge and Dr. Terry Robinson at the University of Michigan, dopamine is not liking. You can have zero dopamine and still enjoy the taste of sugar. Dopamine is wanting. It's the incentive salience. It is the molecule of craving, of motivation, of pursuit. It is the chemical signal that tags the stimulus in your environment and says, that's important. Go get it and don't stop until you have it. When you see a cue, a commercial for a burger, the sign of your favorite bakery, or even just the clock hitting 5 p.m., your brain releases a pulse of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. Nucleus accumbens is a critical brain structure that acts as a key component of the brain reward, pleasure, and addiction circuit. This pulse creates a sensation of urge. It creates a narrowing of focus. It quiets the noise of the rest of the world and amplifies the signal of the food. Now, why does this matter for obesity? Because our modern food environment is engineered to exploit the system. We're surrounded by supernormal stimuli, and this is a term pathologists, who are scientists specializing in the study of animal behavior use. In nature, foods were rarely both high in fat and high in sugar. You had fruit, which is sweet, but also fibrous. You had meat, which is fatty, but also savory. You rarely had a combination of intense sugar, intense fat, and intense salt, all rapidly absorbable and all at once. Modern ultra-processed foods such as donuts, pizza, ice cream, fast food combines these macronutrients in a way that creates a dopamine response that is far grander than anything our ancestors experienced. When you ingest these foods, you get a supraphysiological release of dopamine. It's a spike, and the brain, which seeks homeostasis or balance in all things, has to adapt to that spike. If you constantly flood a room with bright light, your eyes will eventually constrict. If you constantly flood the brain with high dopamine, the brain will downregulate its receptors. It pulls back. It reduces the number of dopamine D2 receptors available to receive the signal. This is a crucial concept called neuroadaptation. Dr. Nora Volkow, the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, has published extensive imaging studies showing that in individuals with severe obesity, there is a marked reduction in D2 receptor availability in the striatum. This creates a state of reward deficiency. Think about what that feels like subjectively if your baseline dopamine transmission is low. The world feels a little flatter. You feel less motivated or less engaged. You might describe it as boredom or mild depression or just lack of spark. But there is one thing that can briefly restore that dopamine to normal levels, the supernormal stimulus, the high-calorie food. Since we're going to be mapping out how to reverse this reward deficiency over the next 4 videos, please make sure you're subscribed. This is a sequence, and you'll need the full framework to see the big picture and hopefully adopt it for yourself. So the behavior of overeating is often not a pursuit of excess pleasure. It's an attempt to self-medicate a deficit or to feel normal again. This is why willpower is the wrong tool for the job. Willpower is a top-down cognitive process. It lives in the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for executive function, planning, and impulse control. The drive to eat lives in the limbic system, the primal survival-oriented part of the brain. In a head-to-head battle between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system almost always wins, especially under stress. Why is that? Because the limbic system controls your autonomic arousal. It controls your anxiety and screams, "This is an emergency." While the prefrontal cortex whispers, "But we had a diet plan." Now we have to discuss a concept of prediction error, because this is how habits are wired into the brain. Your brain is a prediction machine. It's constantly guessing what will happen next. If you eat an apple, your brain predicts a certain caloric reward. You eat it, the calories arrive, the prediction is met, your dopamine stays baseline, and you learn nothing new. But if you eat a highly engineered, hyperpalatable food, the sensory reward is massive, often bigger than the brain predicted. This causes a positive prediction error. Neurons fire rapidly. This signals the brain, "This was better than expected. Remember this. Learn this and try to do it again. Every time you get that better than expected hit, the synaptic connection is strengthened. You're reinforcing the neural pathway that links the cue, the bakery sign, to the action, eating. Over years of exposure to the modern food environment, this learning becomes consolidated. It moves from a conscious choice to an automatic subconscious subroutine. You find yourself scrolling through food delivery apps or turning into the drive-through restaurants without even consciously deciding to do so. Practically, the car just goes there. I want to help you name this process because it's not a character flaw. This is a highly efficient learning machine doing exactly what it evolved to do: secure the most calories with the least effort. The problem is not the machine. The problem is that the machine is operating in an environment it was never designed for. Now I want to pause here and add a layer of necessary nuance. If this mechanism is universal, and if we all have dopamine receptors, and we all live in a world of donuts and delivery apps, why isn't everyone obese? This is where the multifactorial part comes in. We all have different genetic susceptibilities. Some people are born with a highly robust satiety signal. They eat a donut and their homeostatic brain, the stop signal is so loud that it overrides the dopamine. They feel physically ill if they overeat, so they're protected. Other people are born with a genetic variation, perhaps the FTO gene or the MC4R pathway that makes their satiety signal a whisper. For them, the stop signal is in the spectrum of weak. Others are born with a reward surfeit or reward deficit genotype. Some people have fewer dopamine receptors at baseline, making them more vulnerable to seeking external stimulation. And then we have to layer on the environment beyond just food. We have to talk about sleep. When you're sleep deprived, your ghrelin, the hunger hormone, goes up, and your leptin, the satiety hormone, goes down. Another effect of sleep deprivation is impairing the prefrontal cortex. It decouples the executive center from the emotional center. So when you're tired, you're even less capable of saying no to the limbic system. This brings us to the stress conversation. Chronic stress elevates cortisol. Cortisol does two things that are disastrous for weight control. First, it mobilizes glucose, making you hungrier for quick energy, like for sugar. Second, it specifically encourages the storage of visceral fat, which is the fat around your organs. This is because visceral fat is biologically easier to access for rapid energy during a crisis. So if you combine a genetic susceptibility with a high-stress lifestyle, with poor sleep, and then you place that person in an environment where 1,000-calorie hyper-palatable meal is available for $5 and zero effort, obesity is not just possible, it is the predictable biological outcome. I want to now pivot to the gut-brain axis because the brain doesn't just guess what you ate. It knows and keeps track of what you ate on a cellular and molecular level. We have the vagus nerve, a massive superhighway of information connecting the gut to the brainstem. When you eat, your stomach stretches and mechanoreceptors send a signal up the vagus nerve to the nucleus of the solitary tract in the brainstem saying volume received. At the same time, your gut releases peptide hormones like CCK, PYY, and GLP-1. These are chemical messengers that travel through the blood and the nerves to tell the brain nutrients received. In a healthy system, these signals turn down the dopamine. They turn off the wanting. This is why after a huge Thanksgiving meal, the idea of eating more turkey or ham seems repulsive. The system has successfully shut down the drive. But in obesity, we often see a resistance to these signals. We see leptin resistance. And leptin is a hormone made by your fat cells. It circulates in the blood in proportion to your body fat. It tells your brain how much long-term energy you have on board. If your body fat goes up, leptin goes up. The brain sees the high leptin and says, we have plenty of energy, so decrease hunger and increase metabolic rate so we can use the energy. If the leptin levels stay chronically high, as they do in obesity, the brain stops listening. The receptors become desensitized. This creates a terrifying biological reality. The brain of an obese person acts as if it's starving because it can't hear the leptin signal. The brain assumes fat stores are low. So despite carrying excess energy, the brain engages the starvation signal and lowers the metabolic rate to conserve energy. It increases hunger. It makes you cold and sometimes lethargic. This is why simply eating less is so excruciatingly difficult. This is fundamentally because you're fighting a brain that's convinced that you're wasting away at a survival level. If you know someone who's been shamed for failing at diet, please share this video with them. We need to change the global conversation from morality to biology. So when we look at the landscape of obesity, it's a perfect storm. We have the hijack of the reward system by supernormal stimuli and the neuroadaptation of dopamine receptors leading to reward deficiency. We have the breakdown of homeostatic signaling via leptin resistance. And we have the environmental triggers of stress and sleep deprivation that lock the cycle in place. Now, why does this framework matter? Why spend this time understanding the mechanism? Because if you think the problem is lack of character or moral failure, the solution is shame. And shame, as you know, actually increases cortisol and drives further consumption. It's a negative loop, and shaming an obese person ends up backfiring. But if you understand that the problem is a neurometabolic dysregulation, the solution changes. The solution becomes about calibrating the system. It becomes about reducing the inflammation that blocks a signal. It becomes about managing the dopamine inputs. It becomes about sleep. It becomes about targeted nutrition that restores satiety. Physiologically speaking, in order to be successful, you need to stop fighting yourself and instead fix the signaling. Over the next 4 episodes, we're going to build on this foundation. We have established today that the machinery is jammed, but we haven't fully explored what jammed it. Is it just the food, or is it something deeper in your history? Now we must address the individual variability. Why does this happen to some people and not others? This is where the multifactorial nature of the disease is critical. We can't ignore genetics. Genome-wide association studies have identified hundreds of loci associated with body mass index. The most famous is the FTO gene. But interestingly, FTO is highly expressed in the brain, not the fat tissue. It influences appetite regulation and impulse control. Some individuals are born with a highly robust satiety signal. They eat and the stop mechanism is immediate and forceful. Others are born with a leaky stop signal. Some are born with a reward surfeit, a high density of dopamine receptors, making them less likely to seek external stimulation. Others are born with reward deficit, making them vulnerable to the supernormal environment. But genes are only the loaded gun. The environment pulls the trigger. And the most potent environmental trigger beyond the food itself is stress. We can't talk about the neurology of obesity without talking about the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis for short. When you're under chronic stress, whether psychosocial, financial, or traumatic, your body releases cortisol. Cortisol is catabolic to muscle, meaning muscle wasting tendency, and anabolic to visceral fat, meaning wanting to store more fat. It specifically encourages the storage of fat in the abdominal cavity. Why is that? Because visceral fat is more lipolytic. It releases fatty acids more easily, and it's more accessible. In a short-term survival situation, this is great. In a chronic stress situation, it's a disaster. Another effect of cortisol is desensitizing the brain to pleasure. It blunts the dopamine response. So under stress, you need more sugar and more fat to get the same reward response. This is the biological basis of stress eating. And finally, we have the role of sleep. We're living in an epidemic of sleep deprivation. When you restrict sleep to 4 or 5 hours a night, you see immediate measurable changes in neuroendocrine function. Ghrelin, the hunger hormone, spikes. Leptin, the satiety hormone, crashes. But even more insidiously, sleep deprivation impairs the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the big boss of the brain. It's responsible for executive function, long-term planning, and impulse inhibition. It acts as the brake on the system. Think of the limbic system as the reward center and as the gas pedal. Functional MRI studies show that in a sleep-deprived state, connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, which is the emotional center of the brain responding to stress and feeling danger, is weakened. The big boss, the prefrontal cortex, quietly goes offline and the emotional brain takes over. So when we look at the patient with obesity, we're not looking at a person who's simply indulgent. We're often looking at a person with genetic susceptibility to weak satiety, dopamine receptor downregulation due to chronic exposure to supernormal stimuli, leptin resistance due to systemic inflammation, and a prefrontal cortex compromised by stress and sleep deprivation. To label this complex neurometabolic cascade as lack of willpower is not just scientifically inaccurate, it's medically negligent and irresponsible because it can potentially harm people. Willpower is a finite cognitive resource. It's like a battery. You can't run a high energy system on a small battery that's being drained by a survival drive. If the brain thinks you're starving, it will eventually win. It will drive you to eat. And when you do, it will prioritize storage because it believes it's in a famine. This framework changes how we approach treatment. If the problem is a hijack, then the solution is repair. We need to resensitize the dopamine receptors. We need to lower the inflammation to restore leptin sensitivity. We need to recruit prefrontal cortex to manage stress and sleep. And we need to understand that for some phenotypes, pharmacological tools like GLP-1 receptor agonists aren't cheating. They are hormone replacement therapy for a broken gut-brain signal. In this series, we're going to explore each of these levers in detail. We have established the mechanism of the machine, but we've not yet explored the ghost in the machine. Why is the system so stressed? Why is the inflammation there in the first place? In the next episode, we're going to look at the intersection of trauma, including childhood trauma and metabolism. We're going to discuss adverse childhood experiences studies and the compelling data linking early life stress to adult obesity. We're going to ask the question, is the weight acting as a protective mechanism for a dysregulated nervous system? And we'll explore the concept of the wound. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so you don't miss the next episode. We're building a new category here, and that's beyond biohacking and diet culture. It's physiology and biological cost with receipts to help you with optimized tools to individualize your experience. I'm Dr. Amin Hedayat. Stay curious, stay grounded, and as always, stay uninflamed. This is the Metabolic Psychiatry and Neuroscience series, and I'll see you in the next video.